Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book Not God's Type by Holly Ordway. In this video, I will be covering chapters 4 through 6 of the book. But before we get to chapter 4, I want to spend a few minutes on what is called the first interlude of the book. Between chapters 3 and 4 is where this interlude falls. There are 7 interludes throughout the book, and they roughly break the book's 27 chapters down into smaller sections. In this first interlude, Ordway recalls a Good Friday service from a few years after her conversion, when she was called upon to fill in for a reader and recited Psalm 51 and the prayers of the people, which leads the congregation in praying for the world. Ordway writes, quote, "I'd heard these words before in the Good Friday service each of the previous 2 years. Once again, it struck me powerfully that this was not just a general prayer for the lost, it had been a prayer for me. How easy it would have been to write me off, a lost cause, a waste of time, an enemy of Christ. And yet I had been prayed for, by those who knew me and by those who did not. For just a moment I sensed a living web of prayer, bright and strong, connecting past, present, and future, far and near." Well, no arguments here, no claims being made, but I wanted to share that quote because it illustrates something that I think critics of religion often overlook, to our detriment. In last week's video, I read a quote from Ordway where she mentions how it's no good for Christians to be getting impatient with non-Christians who aren't immediately swayed by their arguments. And I said that we non-religious folks should try to remember that as well when we're arguing with religious folks. Logical arguments and empirical evidence won't be persuasive to everybody, at least not immediately, because for many people it wasn't logic and evidence that brought them to their religious faith in the first place. Look at what Ordway describes in that quote. She says that she senses a living web of prayer, which to me sounds like superstitious nonsense, but if you look beyond the religious idiom at what she's actually describing, she's talking about finding a community. She's talking about realizing that she was a part of a community that cared about her, that helped her, connected her to a larger world, and through which she could in turn help and connect with others. And that is very real. The religious trappings surrounding it, not so much. I can do without those. But the sense of belonging and unity and purpose, nothing superstitious about that. You ever find yourself thinking about a religious person and wondering, how can they possibly believe that stuff? Well, that's why. Now, let's move on to chapter 4 of the book, which is titled The Invisible Lamp. Ordway opens this chapter saying that when she was an atheist, she fancied herself as a person totally without faith. She didn't pray. She didn't go to church. She had a relatively secular, non-religious upbringing. She recalls being a child in school and thinking it was strange that people capitalized God, because she knew of many gods from various mythologies and world religions, and she didn't think of God as being a proper name. Well, despite her non-religious upbringing, Ordway frequently encountered elements of Christian culture as she grew up. Her family celebrated a secular version of Christmas, but they also enjoyed listening to a few of the more popular sacred hymns like Silent Night, God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, the ones that pretty much everybody knows regardless of how Christian you are. And her parents' Christmas decorations also included a miniature nativity scene. As an introvert by nature, Ordway discovered a love of reading, and she remembers it as one of the best parts of her childhood. She read many of the classics of the children's literary canon, stuff like Black Beauty, Little Women, Alice in Wonderland. Eventually, she gravitated to works of fantasy, to myths and fairy tales, King Arthur, Chronicles of Narnia, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Though she didn't realize it at the time, these works were also introducing her to aspects of Christianity. King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table sought the Holy Grail, which is, of course, as anyone who's seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade knows, the cup of Christ from the Last Supper. Tolkien's Middle-earth contained numerous parallels with the mythology, and that is my word, not hers, of Christianity. In fact, Ordway now considers reading The Lord of the Rings to have been her introduction to the good news. More on that later. She enjoyed the work of Harlan Ellison for a time in her adolescence, didn't we all? But she moved away from it when she found nothing beneath Ellison's anger. She also read Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern series, but saw that its heroes were a select few chosen for greatness, and she realized that there would be no meaningful place for ordinary people like her in that world. Then she found Star Trek, and specifically Star Trek The Next Generation. She came to regard Captain Picard as a role model, intelligent, upstanding, decisive. She enjoyed the optimistic and adventurous world of Star Trek and the camaraderie of the crew. She read Star Trek novels, she wrote Star Trek fan fiction, and she attended conventions. But ultimately, her Star Trek fandom was unfulfilling. She writes, quote, "In retrospect, the problem was this. You can't buy a phaser or a tricorder. You can only buy a toy that makes a noise like the one on the show. You can't buy a tribble as a pet. You can only get a fake fur ball with a battery-operated purr motor. The very existence of these material props is a reminder that Star Trek is not a real world. I wanted the real thing, real adventure, real meaning, real belonging. I didn't know where to find it, or if it even existed." So she's a Star Trek fan. God, I want to like her so much right now. You have no idea. And Captain Picard is a great one to look up to as far as fictional characters go. He's honest, brave, compassionate, ethical, open-minded, curious, eloquent, and not the worst-looking dude in the world. I'm not saying. I'm just saying. If you ask me who I would rather people take after, Captain Picard or Jesus, I'd say Captain Picard, hands down, not even close. But to me, they're both fictional characters. I'm comparing like with like there. I think there probably was a historical Jesus of some sort, but I doubt he had much in common with the person we read about in the New Testament. The Jesus of the Gospels and the New Testament, in my estimation, is essentially a fictional character. Ordway, on the other hand, considers the Jesus of the New Testament to be a real person. And that's why Captain Picard can't measure up for her. He's not real. Star Trek isn't real. You can buy toy phasers and toy tricorders and toy tribbles, but you can't get the real thing, which in the case of the tribbles is probably a good thing. I think we could all agree. And here, not for the first time in the Atheist Read series, we come to what I find to be one of the most distasteful things about religion in general, and in this case, Christianity. Because Star Trek is an imaginary world. Everybody knows it. The people who make Star Trek, who write and produce the TV shows and films, who perform the characters, who design and build the sets and create the special effects, they're all very open about that. Nobody making Star Trek or selling Star Trek is going to try to tell you that it's real. Not so for religion. When you buy Star Trek, either figuratively by watching it, becoming a fan, or literally by putting down money to buy a ticket to a movie or a book or a Blu-ray set or some bit of merchandise, you know up front what you're buying. It's an honest transaction. But when you buy into Jesus, religion tells you that what you're buying is real. It says you're buying into something real. It tells you, yes, actually, you can have a real phaser. You can have a real tribble, so to speak. Oh, you can't have it now. You'll get it later. You'll get it in the next life, in fact, but you'll get it. We promise that you'll get it. Now, in the meantime, here's what we need from you. The sales pitch to become a Christian is based on promises that people cannot possibly keep and have no right to make in the first place. Someone promised Holly Ordway that Jesus was real, that the eternity of love and purpose and belonging that awaited her in the next life was real, that she accepted that promise and came to believe very sincerely in those things is, for the moment, beside the point. The promise should never have been made. And now she makes that promise to others. passing on as factual truths things which she cannot possibly know. And in some cases, if she follows the pattern established by previous apologetics books I've read, things which are not unknowable but are in fact known and demonstrated to be false. Ordway says the world of Star Trek wasn't enough for her because she wanted the real thing, and Christianity promised her the real thing and convinced her that it had delivered. And in some respects, perhaps it did. It delivered a community. It delivered a sense of belonging. It delivered a feeling of purpose. But divine forgiveness of sin, an all-powerful, all-loving God who hears her prayers and knows the desires of her heart and has a plan for her life, eternal life, there's no evidence to suggest Christianity or any other institution can deliver any of those things. And yet it is those things which are promised time and time and time again. Moving on now to Chapter 5, The Pen and the Sword. Ordway describes her experience entering college. She celebrated Yule, her freshman year actually, though she still wasn't open to Christianity. She was sort of exploring a more general spirituality. In fact, in many of her classes, she got the message that Christianity was based on false beliefs and bad history, and had had a negative impact on civilization. In science, she learned about evolution, and how, by implication, Christians who rejected it were fools to be pitied. She also learned how Christian missionaries had aided colonialism by destroying native religions. And she says, I did not quite know what to think about the integral part that human sacrifice played in the authentic expression of the Aztec religion, but she makes no mention of the enslavement and mass murder of the indigenous peoples of the Americas at the hands of the supposedly civilized European Christians. Anyway, Ordway's art and literature professors tended to downplay the Christian beliefs that may have influenced the writers and the artists that she was studying. In fact, aside from the occasional person passing out religious pamphlets on her campus, she hardly heard about Christianity at all. But in her British writers class, under the tutelage of Professor Keefe, of whom she writes glowingly for the most part, how about that? A positive portrayal of a college professor. It's an apologist trope that has been subverted. We haven't gotten too many of those in any of these series yet, have we? Ordway discovered the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins, which would affect her profoundly, though not quite yet. With Professor Keefe's help, Ordway was able to develop an intuitive love of Hopkins' poetry, appreciating it without feeling the need to critically analyze it. She responded to the well-rounded world described by Hopkins' poetry, a world of fear and pain, but also a world where justice and mercy existed. She developed this deep appreciation for Hopkins, whose work was explicitly Christian, despite now consciously thinking of herself as an atheist. And she writes about this as though this is peculiar. In fact, she uses the word peculiar to describe this. But this doesn't seem so unusual to me. And again, I think we have an instance of Ordway using her own personal experience to speak for the general universal atheist experience. I'm an atheist, and I have an appreciation for many works of art that were created from a decidedly religious viewpoint. I remember reading a translation of the Bhagavad Gita in my early 20s, didn't everybody, and being very impressed by the beauty of the writing, but I've never been a Hindu, never thought about becoming a Hindu. I love the music of Bach and Handel, much of which is sacred in nature. There are even passages of the Bible which resonate with me very strongly. I don't consider it supernatural in any respect, but certain sections of the King James have a power and a beauty equal to anything else ever written in English. You don't have to share the beliefs of the author or the artist, or in the case of King James, the translator, in order to appreciate the work. But despite her discovery of Hopkins, all was not well with college student Holly Ordway. Quote, intellectually, I had accepted a disenchanted view of the world. The beauty of nature was a side effect of the ceaseless blind churning of natural selection. Human nature was merely a product of clever animals with spare time on their hands. The glimpses of meaning from my childhood reading and the sheer exuberance and richness of my imaginative life seemed to have no bearing on my day-to-day experiences. There was no longer any space for transcendence in my life. Now, as with much of what she wrote in the first 3 chapters, which I covered in the previous video of this series, I'm annoyed by this not because of the experience Ordway is sharing, but because she's sharing it to a Christian audience who will likely take it as confirmation of what they already assume all atheists are like. It is very much a stereotype that atheists have this joyless, hopeless, flat, glum view of the world, without inspiration, without meaning, without beauty. And here's the thing. If, as an atheist, Holly Ordway regarded the beauty of nature as nothing more than a side effect of blind natural forces, that's fine. She has the right to feel about nature however she likes. But I'm an atheist too. I believe the world, from the scene right outside my window to the farthest reaches of the universe, is the product of natural forces, and that humans are products of those same natural forces, of evolution, and that our human cultures are entirely of our own making. I don't believe that there was a supernatural or divine hand in any of it. But for me, that doesn't diminish the wonder and joy that I find in these things. It amplifies it. I'll give you an example that you've probably heard before. There is an unbroken chain of events leading from the Big Bang to you living your life at this very moment. In the previous chapter, Ordway referred to being able to sense a web of prayer. And to my way of thinking, from my viewpoint, that is a superstition. But what I am describing is a real phenomenon. It is a scientifically verified phenomenon. There is a complete chain of events connecting you to the beginning of the universe, and therefore to everything else in the universe. We are all connected, literally, not in a sense, not metaphorically, but literally to each other, to the other organisms on this planet, to our planet itself, to the rest of our solar system, to the rest of our universe. We are not merely residents here. We are of this place. As much as the planets and the stars and the unfathomably massive and ancient galaxies, those objects and others come together to form, we are wonders of the universe. Now, do I romanticize that? Do I attach special meaning to it? Do I wax poetic about it? You're damn right I do. But underneath all of that embellishment, it's a fact. It's a scientific fact. And it's the most wondrous fact that I know. And I know of no claimed fact from any religion that even approaches inspiring the sense of wonder in me that fact does. And if Holly Ordway's life as an atheist was without beauty and transcendence, then I truly feel sorry for her. But mine isn't. I don't feel the need to believe in a higher world in order to find meaning and purpose and truth and beauty in this one. It's all around me, and it's within me. And it's within everyone watching this. It's within all of us. We're all a part of it. And what a shame that Christians so often get the opposite message about non-believers. The lie that without belief in God, and specifically belief in their God, that there can be no true appreciation of the beauty and wonder of the world. Once again, Christianity claims as its exclusive property something that by birthright belongs to everyone, regardless of their religious beliefs or lack thereof. Well, in her first year of college, Ordway writes, she became a fencer, which she mentioned in the previous chapters that I covered in the previous video. She was attracted to the sport of fencing because many of her cherished fantasy stories featured sword play, so it felt sort of natural to her. And she was not a natural athlete, but she found that she enjoyed fencing. She enjoyed going to practice. She got along great with her teammates, and she picked up the basics like she was a natural. And while she learned the techniques of fencing, she also learned the protocol, which she likens to the code of honor observed by King Arthur and his knights. Opponents were saluted before bouts, coaches were shown respect, more experienced fencers on the team shared tales of their adventures, read past competitions, with newer members of the team and sort of passed on the tales of daring do. The reality of fencing allowed Ordway to fulfill some of the longing inspired by the fantasy stories that she loved. Well, despite finding something positive in fencing, Ordway still struggled in her social life. She didn't really hang out much with her fencing teammates, and she found herself eventually in a circle of friends who were atheists and who were bitterly contemptuous of Christianity. After graduation, she pursued her master's degree in the southern U.S., and her exposure to Christianity increased greatly, but that only increased her disdain for it. She did not like what she was seeing and experiencing of Christianity in the southern United States. Hellfire and brimstone preaching and strident evangelism only served to darken her already dim regard for the faith. She was happy to return home north to begin work on her doctorate. She didn't like Christianity, and she definitely was not looking for God. And again, she is offering an extremely limited view of atheism and atheists, and implicitly presenting it as just the way it is. Atheists are all jerks who enjoy maliciously mocking religious people, and we have no sense of meaning in our lives. And that is definitely true for some atheists, but it is definitely not an accurate portrait of all atheists. And, you probably shouldn't draw any sweeping conclusions about atheism or atheists based on resentful, know-it-all college student atheists. And in fact, you probably would be best served not to draw sweeping conclusions about any group based on members of that group who are resentful, know-it-all college students. The only group you can safely do that sort of reasoning with is, of course, resentful know-it-all college students, because they're the worst. Moving on now to Chapter 6, Winter and Spring. Ordway wrote her doctoral dissertation on fantasy literature, focusing on The Lord of the Rings. She describes this as peculiar, there's that word, since she was very much an atheist at the time, and Lord of the Rings is, in the words of Tolkien himself, a fundamentally religious work. Again, if Ordway feels this was peculiar, that's fine. That's her experience. That's her interpretation of her experience. But there's nothing necessarily unusual or inconsistent about an atheist being interested or even greatly appreciative of a religious work, especially one that appeals to people on levels other than the religious level. Many of you watching this video are probably atheists who are fans of Tolkien, or at least you know people who are atheists and Tolkien fans. Because Christ knows I do. Anyway, Ordway describes how reading The Lord of the Rings kept what she calls a ray of light shining in her otherwise dreary existence as an atheist. The world of The Lord of the Rings is a world of grace, Ordway says, where suffering is not an obstacle to be overcome in order to reach the happy ending, but it is the path through which the happy ending is reached. Ordway writes of how writing her dissertation on Tolkien immersed her in what she describes as a sacramental world, a world that, while not historically true, contained truths of the moral and spiritual kind. Though she resists identifying any particular character as a stand-in for Christ, she does point out Aragorn as a model of the ideal king, a ruler deserving of love and loyalty, who could walk among his people while retaining his regal qualities. And here's a quote on that subject that I found kind of odd. Quote, "I didn't fully realize this connection," meaning the connection between Christ and Aragorn, "until I reread The Lord of the Rings for about the 8th time, now as a Catholic, at which point the parallel between Aragorn and Christ the King became so vividly apparent that I thought to myself, how did I never notice this before?" I know! Remember, she was still an atheist when she wrote her doctoral dissertation on The Lord of the Rings. Am I really supposed to believe she never even thought to draw a parallel between Aragorn and Christ until years later when she was rereading the book for the 8th time. And if she didn't think to draw that parallel herself, she never heard about it, she never saw anyone else draw that parallel, she didn't run across it while doing research, no one she talked to ever brought it up? I mean, isn't it a fairly obvious line to draw? For shit's sake, half the male protagonists in Western literature can be interpreted as Christ figures. She really never noticed that Aragorn, one of the major characters in her favorite book, had some parallels with Christ? I find that really hard to believe from someone who was a student of literature and got to the point of writing a doctoral dissertation on a piece of literature. And it wasn't until years later, rereading the book for the 8th time, that it suddenly dawned on her, oh, Aragorn has some Christ-like qualities. I'm not sure what I'm saying by bringing any of this up. I find it fascinating and kind of baffling. Anyway, after earning her doctorate and working outside of her field for a few years, Ordway got a job teaching literature at a college in California. And for the first time in many years, she returned to the poetry that she had loved as a student, because now she had to teach this poetry to other students. And she rediscovered how deeply rooted in Christianity much of it was. At first, she regarded the faith of the poets as irrelevant to the work, but the more she read, the more connected to their depictions of God and relationships with God she became. And she was stirred by John Donne's plea to God in his Holy Sonnet 14, break, blow, burn, and make me new. Then the breakthrough came when she rediscovered Hopkins, and she read Hopkins' work, Carrion Comfort, which she quotes from, which reads, I'll not carry in comfort despair, not feast on thee, not untwist, slack they may be, these last strands of man in me, or, most weary, cry, I can no more. I can something, hope, wish day come, not choose not to be. And what spoke to Ordway was the fact that Hopkins and Donne were not describing the bland, simple faith that she saw being offered by modern evangelists. Hopkins did not, as Ordway puts it, blunt sharp edges. And she found herself receptive to Christianity, though still not quite consciously looking for it. She says, quote, poetry had done its work. I was ready to listen. And the person who would speak what I needed to hear would not be a poet or a professor, nor even a pastor or a priest, but rather my fencing coach. Who would have thought? And that's where we leave off at the end of chapter 6. Do you know what I find very interesting? Here we are 6 chapters into this book. We are almost a quarter of the way through the book and our study of the book. And she's telling us the story of how she went from atheism to faith in Christ. Barely a word so far about the Bible. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, she credits reading The Lord of the Rings as introducing her to the good news. Not the book that contains the literal good news itself. And I'm sure that's coming. But given how much space the Bible, the Word of God, typically occupies in these How I Found God stories, I'm struck by its irrelevance to this story so far. Ordway was moved by literature, by fantasy stories with Christian overtones, by poetry written by Christians expressing their faith, but not by the almighty Bible. Of course, one could say that the faith those other writers were exploring and expressing through their own work was rooted in the Bible, so it all leads back there eventually, and I suppose that's true. But I don't think I've read another apologist's conversion story where this far into it, the Bible had played no direct role at all in inspiring the heathen to discover faith in God. It's just interesting, I guess, is all I'm saying. I'll enjoy it while it lasts, because I get the feeling that once she reaches the then I read the Word of God stage of the story, it'll be conversion story formula from then on out. Although again, hey, I hope she subverts that expectation too. I hope I'm wrong. We'll find out, because in the next video, I will be covering the next 4 chapters of the book. Chapter 7, Inching Forward. Chapter 8, Perfect Justice or Perfect Mercy. Chapter 9, On Guard. And Chapter 10, Crossing Swords. Those will be the 4 chapters I will cover in the next video. That's it for this video. I want to thank you as always for watching. I do sincerely appreciate it. If you have anything to say in response to what I have had to say, something you agree with, something you disagree with, something you think I got right, something you think I got wrong, please share your responses to what I have had to say in the comment section of this video. If you enjoyed this video, if you find this video to be worthwhile, if you find what I do in general to be worthwhile, I want to invite you, as I always do, to consider becoming a supporter of this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/SteveShives to become a supporter of this channel for as little as $1 a month. And $1 a month helps me immensely. You cannot imagine how grateful I am for every pledge that I receive. But if you pledge at a level of $10 a month or more, if you think I'm worth it and you can afford it, I have begun posting the scripts for these videos on my Patreon feed, accessible for patrons pledging at the $10 a month level or higher. So if you want to read the scripts, if you want to have something written to refer to for these videos, and you don't want to be transcribing it yourself, I don't know why you would be writing it, then consider becoming a patron, and becoming a patron at the $10 a month level or higher. Anyway, that's my sales pitch. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time.